Greg, the comments in an email from Mike Pezzullo to his Home Affairs staff, it's ended up now on the front page of the Times in London. What do you make of this, the debate around this intervention from Mike Pezzullo?
Well, Kieran, I want to unequivocally defend Mike Pezzullo. This is a ridiculous controversy about measured comments which did not mention China by name and which describe no more than the basic reality which is in front of everyone's face. I think Labor's criticisms here are opportunistic and hypocritical. I have the greatest respect for the senior Labor people in national security, but what they're really saying is you want the government to be transparent and open with the Australian people unless, God forbid, someone says something worth hearing. Then, of course, we must enforce a strict do not mention the war policy. Now, frankly, the Times putting it all across the front of their page one, you know, much as I love and admire the Times, our sister publication, has got to be the most bizarre misjudgment of news value I've ever seen in my life. This was a measured, well-crafted, sensible speech by a senior Australian public servant. Let me tell you, Pezzullo has been very important to the fate of the coalition government because he's a public servant who gets things done and is prepared to do the tough things on national security. He's not out campaigning, he's not a politician, he's served Labor governments as faithfully as he's served coalition governments. And I think the outrage, the mock outrage, you'd think it was Pezzullo who was taking shocking security actions in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, not the Chinese government. But somehow or other it's an offence against civilisation for Pezzullo to draw attention to the obvious. But how can the Australian nation be prepared if we're scared of having a dialogue which mentions reality? I think this has been a poor episode in Australia, not because Pezzullo is undisciplined, but because the reaction is so hysterical.
The email itself, more broadly, is measured. That phrase, the drumbeats of war, or, you know, if that was said by a defence minister, would you have the same assessment, Greg? Is it a reasonable use of language, do you think?
Well, of course it is, Kieran. I mean, it was a rather poetic, rather elegiac speech. I wasn't quite sure that Pez had that level of poetry in him. But, you know, the chief of the Pacific Command of the United States said a couple of weeks ago he thinks there's a very good chance of war between of China taking military action to recover Taiwan within the next 6 years. Every day we are seeing Chinese Air Force incursions into Taiwanese airspace and very frequently into Japanese airspace. China has occupied and militarised an area equivalent to the Mediterranean in the South China Sea. Every strategic jackass from here to Timbuktu is saying there is a possibility of military conflict in the next few years. Now, everything Australia does, as Scott Morrison said today, is designed to prevent war, partly by telling the Chinese that the cost of military action against Taiwan would be very high because the United States and its alliance system would respond. But the idea that you cannot even mention this. So, OK, Pez used an unusually poetic phrase here, the drumbeats of war. But really, are we at the state as a nation where we have a nervous collapse because a senior public servant uses a phrase redolent in literary history? And as I say, our ridiculous overreaction has led to the Times newspaper making a ridiculous news misjudgment. But it just goes to show how aggressive China's actions have become, because as soon as you say something like this, everyone says you must be referring to China, whereas, of course, Mike's comments could have been referring to Russian actions in the Ukraine and so forth just as easily. And it shows still a certain level of unwillingness to face reality. I mean, the one criticism I make of the government is, although this is the best performing government we've had on defence since at least John Howard, it is still not moving fast enough, or strongly enough, or urgently enough to confront the national security challenges we face. But Pezzullo contributing to the public dialogue this way is entirely a good thing, and, you know, it helps the nation understand the reality it's facing.
Greg Sheridan, as always, thanks.
Thanks, Kieran.